When Barack Obama was president, he was asked if he believed in American exceptionalism. Did he believe that the United States was unique, exceptional, among other countries? And he thought about it. He was asked this in a news conference. And he thought about it. And he said, yes, I believe that the United States is exceptional. But I also believe that other countries are exceptional in their own way. Now, this was an artful answer to a question that has engaged, vexed Americans, and especially American leaders, for quite a long time. And it comes down to, is the United States like other countries? Is the United States some ways different from other countries? It has long been a feature of American self-regard that the United States is different. John Winthrop, Puritan governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, said that the United States, that America, this Massachusetts Bay Colony, was like a city on a hill, and it was shining its light for the world to see. And this image of the city on a hill, this is the United States. It's setting an example for other nations. Was the first clear statement. And this was when the New England colony was less than 20 years old. So it's an early statement of this belief that the United States is different. And it's not simply different, but it's different in a better way. And it's different in a way that has meaning for the rest of the world. So it's this shining city on a hill that other countries, other peoples can see. And this idea of American exceptionalism persisted into the 18th century. Winthrop was talking in the early 17th century, in the 1600s, in the 17th century, when the United States, or the American colonies, broke free from Britain. And in this respect, the United States actually was exceptional. It was really it was the first time that a country, an independent country, had been created by the will of its people. Until this time, countries, they weren't created, they evolved. They sort of grew out of whatever was there before. Sometimes a new government would come in, sometimes one country would invade and take over another country. But the idea that you could just, basically at the stroke of a pen, Thomas Jefferson's pen, and the signatures of all the ones who signed it, you could create this new country, this United States of America. This was novel. And furthermore, that it could be created on the principle of the will of the people. That this was a very Enlightenment concept. It was an idea that appealed to Enlightenment philosophers. Before this, people thought again that countries emerged organically, that countries were just sort of the people and their history. But the idea that you could create this new country because the people in it didn't like the old country, this was revolutionary. And of course, it took the American Revolution to put it into effect. So this idea of American exceptionalism was written into, as John Winthrop said, from the very colonial beginnings, and then with the Declaration of Independence, with the Constitution of the United States. Now, the Constitution of the United States wasn't that exceptional, not even in the United States, because by then all of the states had written their own constitution, so the idea that you could write a constitution. But still, it's a pretty revolutionary idea, and other countries of the world didn't have constitutions like this. Some of them had sort of approximations. The British, the English, had what they called their constitution. But their constitution, the British still, by their constitution, mean a collection of judicial decisions, of political practices, of notions that people have about the way the government works. The British do talk about their constitution, but it's not in a small pamphlet form like the U.S. Constitution was written in paper. You have to go through law books and history books and all this other stuff. There's the idea of a constitution. Again, the United States is seeming pretty, what shall I say, exceptional. And exceptional simply means you're the exception and that you're different from other countries. And when Obama was answering the question, he was answering it in an honest way historically, because while Americans considered themselves exceptional and their country exceptional, well, indeed, so did the British, and so did the French, and so did the Russians, and so did the Chinese. It's fair to say that any sort of large country or people that has success in the world tends to think that it's different, it's unusual. And so you have this situation where there are these competing exceptionalisms around the world. And as I say, the Chinese are probably the best and oldest example of this, where the Chinese called themselves the middle kingdom, at the middle of the universe, and all other kingdoms, all other countries should, in their proper relations, be paying tribute to China. And there's nothing particularly wrong with the idea that people like their country best. It'd be unusual maybe if they didn't. It's a little bit like rooting for the home team in whatever your favorite sport is. And there are plenty of teams, whether they be professional or college, where the fans say, we're number one, and they can't all be number one, but maybe they're number one in the hearts of the fans. So this idea of pride in the group that you're part of, it's as common as humanity, and inherently there's nothing particularly wrong with it. But it very often becomes a way of explaining or rationalizing things that a country wants to do that maybe don't pass muster with other countries. And so the French, for example, they had what they called their civilizing mission. The French long considered themselves to be the most civilized people on earth. And when French soldiers and sailors went out and claimed colonies for France, whether the colonies were in North America or in Africa or in Southeast Asia, they spoke in terms of a civilizing mission. And it was for the good of the people being colonized, said the French, that they were being colonized, because they would now partake of French civilization, which was this great thing. And the British, they weren't so culturally smug about it, but the British did believe that their system of politics, of a balanced government, of the monarchy and the parliament and all this was the apex of civilization, or this is the apex of human organization. And when the British went out and conquered colonies in, North America and in Africa and in South Asia, then they argued the same thing. They didn't have quite the succinct label for it, this civilizing mission, but the whole idea was that the British were going to show people how to organize their affairs. Now, as in the case of the French, as in the case of the British, this claim wasn't entirely empty, because when the British moved into certain areas, they imposed order, they imposed peace on localities that had been riven by sectional rivalries. And when they went into parts of Africa, they were able to impose peace on the differing tribes that had been warring with each other. The British were the ones who sort of created the idea of India as this entity, because when they went in there, India was divided into a whole bunch of competing and often warring groups, and the British imposed order on it. This idea that imperial powers can impose order, it goes back at least to Roman times, when the Romans, they imposed a peace. It was called the Pax Romana, the peace of the Romans, Roman peace, on the region around the Mediterranean. And there's something to be said for this argument. You can't just wave it aside as self-serving. It is indeed self-serving, yeah. But it's more than that. Because if you were an ordinary person in a part of Spain or North Africa or in Gaul, what would become France, and you were liable to be beat up by whatever warlord or tribe or group came through, you might be actually quite happy that the Romans showed up. And they cracked the whip over these various warlords, and it meant that you could go about your daily business and not do it at risk of your life. You probably had to pay taxes of some sort, but you might well decide that that was a fair exchange. Not that you were actually given the free decision over it, but nonetheless, there is something to be said for empire. Not everything to be said for empire, not as much said for empire as the imperialists often said, but nonetheless, these arguments, they did hold to some degree. In the case of the United States, the United States did not acquire an empire, at least not exactly and not early. The United States originally was 13 states clinging to the Atlantic coast of North America. But before long, the United States began to expand, and expanded across the Appalachians and Allegheny Mountains into the Mississippi Valley. It expanded then beyond that, beyond the Mississippi, into the Louisiana Territory, eventually to the Pacific Ocean. And as it did so, Americans began emphasizing this idea of American exceptionalism because they had to explain how it was that they could ignore, in fact, indeed, how they could fly in the face of the wishes of the people who were being displaced by this expansion, in particular, the American Indian tribes. So most of them did not want to be displaced. Many of the Indians had died, were dying, under the onslaught of introduced diseases, and so the numbers were less than they had been before, but a whole lot of what was going on was that the Indians were simply being pushed aside. The treaties would be signed, and the treaties were often signed by the chiefs of one part of the tribe, and other parts of the tribe weren't consulted, or at least they weren't able to object. And so then the government of the United States would say, okay, you signed this treaty, therefore you've given up this land, and so on. But it was, I won't say it was done deceitfully. Most of the people who signed the treaties were reasonably sincere, but the treaties often weren't followed through on. For example, that they would promise annuities. There'd be a payment to the tribe, and the payments often came late or came short. And then a new group of people, more settlers, would go out and they would want some of the land that had been claimed by the Indians, and so there'd be a new version that'd be pushed aside. There were a lot of battles, a lot of wars that were fought. And white Americans, had to figure out how to explain this, because they lived in this country that was based on the principle of rule by the people, self-government. This is what the American Declaration of Independence is all about, the American Constitution is all about. And as that system evolved into democracy, where ordinary people actually get to exercise power, this is in fact takes place at the height of American westward expansion, you got this situation where Americans are saying, we believe in self-government, except for those people whose land we want to take. So how do you explain this? How do you rationalize this? Do you simply acknowledge to yourself, yeah, we say one thing and do something else, that we're being dishonest in our actions, if not necessarily in our words when we give our words? Is that the way you deal with it? Well, most people don't. Most people want what they say to coincide with what they do. And it's probably the case that people are more likely to change what they say than what they do. They do things because they want something. In this case, the settlers wanted the land. And so they might change what they say. And so what Americans did was they developed this concept, this sort of full-blown concept of American exceptionalism. And American exceptionalism said that, well, it's different for us. So when we conquer other people's lands, it's not like when the British do it, because the Americans had rejected what the British had done, threw the British out and said, we're going to have a country of our own. We're going to govern it ourselves, except we're not going to include the Indians in this. And so what Americans talked about was American exceptionalism. And the term that they used in the mid-19th century was manifest destiny. But it's basically the same thing. It says the rules for us are different from the rules for other people because it is America's destiny. And manifest just means it's becoming obvious. It's our destiny that we spread across North America. Because why? Why is this justified? Why is this good not only for us, but for the people whose land we are taking, whose land we are moving into? Well, it was basically a version of the French civilizing mission, because Americans are going to bring democracy to the people, self-government. They didn't always use the term democracy because, well, we're not going to let the Indians vote exactly. But self-government, being a little bit vague about what it meant, it was often connected to the idea of Christianity, because we are going to bring Christianity to the heathen Indians. And between those two, the argument was, we're going to make life for the Indians much better than it would be if we'd never been here. Now, there was some finessing that had to be done here to say that the lives of these Indians is going to be better. No, in fact, what some of the people who were making these arguments were honest enough to say is, well, the Indians of this generation aren't going to like it. And in fact, their lives might be worse than they were before. Because before we came along, they got to hunt, travel, live freely and do all that stuff. And now we're making them live on reservations. And even farmers, many of them would admit, they didn't pretty like being behind a plow all day. And most Indians, when they saw what farmers did, they said, we don't want anything like that. We liked our old hunting ways, hunting and gathering and traveling and stuff. But said the American exceptionalists, the believers in manifest destiny, it will be better for their children because the Indian populations were indeed declining, and it looked as though the Indians might just disappear. Many of the Indian tribes of the eastern part of the United States had essentially just disappeared. And so to the tribes of the middle of the country, some including tribes that had been moved there into Indian territory, what's going to become Oklahoma, tribes like the Cherokees and the Chickasaws, but also to the tribes of the plains like the Sioux, the Lakotas and Apaches and Comanches and other tribes. If you resist America's exceptional way of doing it, you are going to simply disappear from the face of the earth. You will have no grandchildren. But if you accept the model, then your grandchildren will be able to prosper. Your grandchildren will be able to thrive. Your grandchildren will have lots of children of their own and lots of children of their own. At this point, it's worth commenting that one common measure of the success of a country, of a political system, of an economy was how fast the population grew. And the presumption was that if your population grew quickly, then you were doing better than if your population just stagnated. And there's definitely something to this argument because the reason population stagnated before this is that lots of children died in infancy. It wasn't that the parents weren't having sex or anything like that, and kids weren't being conceived, but they were conceived and born healthier, and they tended to grow into adults. And so the population of the Anglo-American or the Euro-Americans was doubling roughly every generation, whereas the population of the Indians was declining every generation. And so this argument was, we must be doing something better than you are. Why don't you get some of this? And if you don't volunteer for it, we'll force it upon you. But we're doing it for your own good. You hear this again and again. And we can make this claim, said the people, because America is different. America is exceptional. Okay, so this is a brief history of American exceptionalism. It moves out of the United States proper to the world at the end of the 19th century, when the United States claims colonies in the Philippines and in Puerto Rico and smaller Pacific islands, including Hawaii. And Americans have to explain this one away because the United States, Americans, had always been opposed to the idea of empire. The United States was born in an anti-colonial and anti-imperial revolution. So how can the United States become an empire itself? There's some explaining that has to be done. And the rationalization, the answer to that question, again, is America's different. America is exceptional. We are going to educate the Filipinos, to focus on the Filipinos. We're going to educate the Filipinos so they will be prepared for self-government in due course. Now, a criticism of this was made that, well, why not just give the Filipinos self-government right then? And a reasonable response, and this is, you can't really dispute this very seriously, is that the reason the United States couldn't simply give the Filipinos self-government then was it was a brutal world that existed at the beginning of the 20th century in 1899, 1900, when this decision was being made. This was the heyday, the height of European empires and Asian empires. And so American leaders, William McKinley, could say, if we don't take the Philippines and basically protect them and educate them, and the term often was used, uplift them, well, they're simply going to be snatched by the British. That wouldn't be quite so bad. The British were pretty civilized, these things go. The French, Not so good. The Dutch had a bad track record. They had a big empire in Southeast Asia, in what's going to become Indonesia. The worst would be the Germans or the Japanese. And the Japanese were known to be especially brutal in the colonies that they took. And so, said McKinley and these other American imperialists, I'll call them now American exceptionalists, they said, better us than one of those others. And it's not better us than Philippine independence, because the Philippines wasn't prepared to defend itself against these other empires. And this is something that's really important to keep in mind, just in general. If you happen to be criticizing, let's say, the status quo in American politics or in anything, it's never a fair choice between the status quo, the way things are, imperfect as they are, and perfection. That's not the way the world works. It's a choice between this set of imperfections and some other set of imperfections. And so, on its face, McKinley's argument and decision was reasonable enough at the time, supposing that the United States actually did follow through and prepare the Filipinos for independence. In fact, to some degree, to America's credit, it did follow through, and the Philippines gained independence in 1946. Now, that's a little bit farther down the road, but when we bring American exceptionalism into the 20th century, then it gets its biggest boost during World War II, because this is the war for civilization. This is the war for the world. This is a war where the United States squares off against monstrous evil in the form of German Nazism, in the person of Adolf Hitler, and Japanese militarism in the Pacific. And the United States leads the winning side. The United States did not win the war on its own. It had a great deal of help, especially from the Russians, but the Soviets, but also from the British and other members of the United Nations alliance. That's what the alliance against Germany and Japan and Italy was called, the United Nations. That was the original United Nations. And anyway, so Americans could think, yeah, we're actually doing good stuff here. And the United States did great stuff for the world during World War II. Because if the United States had not come into the war, then Russia might very well have collapsed. The British might have collapsed. And the fascists, especially the German fascists, the Nazis, would have taken over Europe. And a dark night might very well have set in on Europe. It was bad enough in the territories that the Nazis occupied and controlled during the war, as the 6 million killed in the Nazi Holocaust discovered. So for Americans to say, we're on the side of right, and Americans tended to believe in the context of World War II that right makes might. You've probably heard it the other way around. A very cynical version is might makes right. No. The American view was that right makes might. The United States has discovered the way to organize. It's discovered democracy. It's discovered, capitalism in the American economy. And it's this combination of democracy and capitalism that allows the United States, Americans would say, to win World War II. And we'll use that as shorthand, because the United States was, again, kept the British and the Russians in the war. And so the United States won World War II. And coming out of World War II, Americans had perfectly reasonable grounds for saying, we're exceptional, this United States. Look at the United States in the context of world history. And if you make the judgment, let's say in the 1950s, what you'd have to acknowledge is that from being this small, struggling country along the Atlantic coast of North America in the 1770s, the United States became the most powerful country on earth by the 1950s. But it wasn't just power. It was, the term that was often used was righteous power. Again, Americans believed that right made might. And so, for the United States to take the leadership of the world in the period after World War II made perfect sense to Americans. Not only is it good for the United States, but it's good for the world. After all, World War II, the American experience in World War II was good for the United States, but it was also good for the world. And who could really deny it? Would Europe be happier under Hitler? I really don't think so. Would Asia be happier under Japanese control? Almost nobody in Asia would have said that. So Americans came out of World War II with this notion that American exceptionalism was stronger and more important to the world than ever. And Americans took this attitude into the Cold War. And it's one of the things that led the United States into Korea, the war in Korea, against communism, when communist North Korea attacked anti-communist, non-communist South Korea, and the United States came to the aid of the South Koreans. And then eventually Americans found themselves fighting against the communist Chinese in Korea. So this is one where Americans, still kind of rolling on this idea of American exceptionalism, think, we are standing up for the values that all people of the world share, or would share if they had the opportunity. This was the heyday of the idea of America, and particularly American president, as leader of the free world. The free world, this is conceptualization of the United States and its allies and like-minded countries, democracies, people who believed in individual liberty, who believed in free choice of the ballot box, freedom of speech, and all this other stuff, in contrast primarily to the communist countries that didn't believe in any of that stuff. And so American exceptionalism is riding pretty high. The war in Korea put a little bit of a dent in this because the United States did not win the war in Korea. It succeeded in allowing the communists to swallow up South Korea. But then the United States actually went into North Korea trying to make North Korea free from communist rule, and failed. And so the war in Korea ended in a draw, an armistice, a ceasefire, a tie basically. And oh well, okay, so that's not so good. Now allow several more years and the United States goes into Vietnam. And when the United States went into Vietnam, there was a belief that we need to go into Vietnam to prevent the communists from getting more powerful. There was always, and going back to the 1770s, there was an element of self-interest in American exceptionalism, but there was also a strong belief that this is for the good of other people as well. And so American troops went into South Vietnam, partly for the defense of the people of South Vietnam, who most of them did not want to be taken over by communists. And Americans could say, would we want to be controlled by a communist government? No. And so we will help the South Vietnamese people defend themselves against a communist takeover. So in that regard, it was sort of more of the same of America's, we know what we're doing, we know what values we're standing for. And furthermore, that we can make it happen. Yeah, okay, it didn't quite work out in Korea, but that was the exception. The model is World War II. See, we showed the world that right makes might. Well, the war in Vietnam did not turn out the way Americans had hoped it would. And the United States wound up losing in Vietnam. And those South Vietnamese people that American troops had been defending, they were indeed taken over by the communists of North Vietnam at the end of the war. And this really dealt a blow to the concept of American exceptionalism, because if right makes might, well, right wasn't making might so much anymore. North Vietnam, this was a 4th, 5th, 10th rate military power, and it defeated the military power of the United States. How did that happen? And it was about this same time that Americans discovered at home that their government had been lying to them in the context of the Vietnam War, but also in the context of politics. This was the era of the Watergate scandal. So the concept of American exceptionalism really took it, on the chin or upside the head or something like that. And Americans began to doubt whether this country was as exceptional as Americans had thought. And it's fair to say that on the left half of the political spectrum, among the Democrats, it was pretty common to say, no, this American exceptionalism, that was just a cover story for jingoism or for excessive nationalism and militarism. It never was true, and it's not true now. And this was the background. Oh, and I should say then, on the conservative half, on the Republican half of the spectrum, a belief in American exceptionalism was a necessary corollary of a belief in American patriotism. So if you believe in the United States, you must think the United States is exceptional. The United States is the best. The U.S. is number one. And this was the background for the question that was put to Barack Obama, because he was sort of left center in the Democratic Party. And he gets elected president of the United States. And so he's asked, do you believe in American exceptionalism? And it It was sort of a trick question because if he says no, then he's going to outrage the conservatives in the country who says he's unpatriotic, he's anti-American. In fact, if you didn't believe in American exceptionalism, you're often called anti-American. On the other hand, if he says, yeah, I'm all in on American exceptionalism, then he alienates much of his own party who says, wait, this American exception was a cover for all this other stuff. And which is why he sort of tried to find a middle ground and said, yeah, America's exceptional, but so are other countries. In fact, such was the uproar of this that Obama was forced to revisit the question and say, now, I really do believe in American exceptionalism and try to leave it at that. But as we've seen, there's sort of more to it than that. It's a long story, and the question, it's still around in various forms.